Again, we're tying together the knots of the role of the AFL-CIO internationally. And our next speaker is going to bring another connection that is important because of the struggle for the Palestinian people, the Palestinian working class, and the role of the AFL-CIO in relationship to supporting the Zionist apartheid regime. So welcome Carol Lang, who's a professor at CUNY and also an activist in the fight to defend Palestinian workers.
Before I get onto this topic, I'd like to mention that I was a delegate in DC 37, which was a local in AFSCME, the union that Kim was talking about. And at that point, McEntee in the 80s was making $400,000 a year. And so he and the rest of the trade union leadership, and I put that in quotes, wasn't about to give up their lucrative positions in order to defend the workers. The other thing that happened, and then I'll get on to the Histadrut, was when I was a delegate in the union, I raised a resolution that DC 37 should disinvest from supporting Israeli bonds. And it was as if I was speaking Chinese or something. People were like, what is she saying? What do you mean? And then the gavel started coming down, and I said, I have every right to speak, and I'm going to raise my resolution. And by the next month, the resolution was wiped off the books, and I was told, and we were told that there will be no more racism inside the union. So that's the experience of me with the AFL and specifically with DC 37. But my talk today is about the Histadrut, which is the union. Am I okay? Which is the union that represents, quote, represents the workers of Israel and the Palestinians. And I want to talk about their relationship with the AFL and the Histadrut's relationship with the AFL and the CIA. Israel was born in the state of the decline of capitalism, and during a period when people like Mussolini were coming to power. And so the connection between the leadership of the Histadrut, which was absolutely pro-Mussolini and absolutely made deals with Hitler, saw basically, you know, a way of, but also at the same time, you have many Jewish workers who are staunchly socialist. And so the Histadrut, which was led by people like Ben-Gurion, who was a murderer of the Palestinians, used the desire of the Jews who went to Israel as a battering ram, in a sense, against the Palestinians. So we start out with Herzl, who was the sort of the founding philosopher of Zionism. And he said, given a choice, would he go to Israel or would he go to Palestine? And he basically said this: shall we choose Palestine or Argentine? We shall take what is given us and what is selected by Jewish public opinion. The society will determine both these points. Argentine is one of the most fertile countries in the world, extends over a vast area, has sparse population, a mild climate. The Argentine Republic would derive considerable profit from the cession of a portion of the territory to us. But about Palestine, he says, the very name of Palestine would attract our people with a force of marvelous potency. If His Majesty the Sultan were to give us Palestine, we could in return undertake to regulate the whole finances of Turkey. We should there form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia. So this guy is coming with the European mentality of colonialism already, against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. We should, as a neutral state, remain in contact with all Europe, which would have to guarantee our existence. The sanctuaries of Christendom would be safeguarded by assigning to them an extraterritorial status such as well known to the law of nations. We should form a guard of honor about these sanctuaries, answering for the fulfillment of this duty with our existence. The guard of honor would be the great symbol of a solution to the Jewish question after 18 centuries of Jewish suffering. The attitude of Herzl did two things. One of them was it was a colonial attitude. We're going there and we're going to be the guardians of essential Christendom and civilization against these barbarians. But the other purpose of Herzl was to fight against socialism, because my parents, and I know many other people who had come from Russia, in particular in Poland, were people who were communists, who actually opposed the World War I because they saw it as an inter-imperialist war. So Herzl was trying to fight on two fronts. On one front, which was to impose imperial policies inside of Palestine, but also to squash. He saw Zionism as an antidote to socialism, which is what the Jews in Eastern Europe in particular were looking for. So they had to set up a trade union in order to promote working class identity. The idea of working class identity really was a very fascist mentality, because he saw the workers' movement in Israel as being a movement towards creating a nation, as opposed to seeing the working classes fighting against capitalism. So the Histadrut, which was set up, was a pretend socialist, with a pretend socialist character of a new Israeli project that would build capitalism ultimately in Palestine, with the idea that the working class was going to have a place that it was going to be able to call its own. But unlike traditional Western trade unions, the Histadrut was never a labor organization, but an arm of the Israeli state. And not surprisingly, although exactly not the same, the unions, as constituted in Italy during the period of Mussolini, was also an arm of the state. The leadership of the Zionists never saw the working class or the Histadrut being an independent organization. And so in some ways it mirrors Mussolini more than it mirrored Western trade union, the Western trade union movement. Neither were independent, as I said. The entities, although the Histadrut built its reputation based on the working class and based on workers, largely the Histadrut was the bourgeoisie, because they had their own establishments that they had organized, and without the Histadrut, the Israeli ruling class, the Israeli capitalist system, would have not been a going concern. So it was really the backbone of the Histadrut that helped the Israeli capitalism get off the ground. As a matter of fact, many of the leaderships of the Golda Meir and Ben Gurion and all were members of the Histadrut. Golda Meir said the Histadrut does not have the semblance of independence because it is part of the state apparatus. She said she was put on the executive committee at a time when this big labor union wasn't just a trade union organization, it was a great colonizing agency. So right from the jump, the Histadrut and the colonizing agencies of the Zionist organizations worked together to overcome Palestinian resistance and to set up a Zionist capitalist state. It was never pro-worker. The Histadrut owned 25% of Israeli industry. From its height, the privatization of industry caused the decline in caused the decline of membership in the privatization of its National Health Service. In 1958, the International Institute for Development, Cooperation, and Labor Studies was established as a means of furthering Western interests in the global South. In 1960, Histadrut formed the Afro-Asian Institute for Labor Studies and Cooperation, funded by the CIA through the auspices of the AFL. It thus operated as an arm of the Israeli and U.S. foreign policy. It operated on behalf of the U.S. in African countries such as Zaire and Kenya. ISCOR, which is its steel company, owned 51%, Histadrut owned 51% of ISCOR Industries, and 49% was owned by South Africa. The South African corporation manufactured steel for Africa's armed forces against the rising movement in Africa for the South African masses for independence from South Africa and from its racist regime. Right behind them was Israel building arms, building steel, shipping it to South Africa so that South Africa could then participate in putting down the masses of the South African workers. Other Histadrut companies such as Tadurun and Soltam were equally complicit in supplying South Africa with weaponry. It also helped build the electronic wall between South Africa and Namibia and neighboring South African states. It is recognized by the International Confederation of Free Trade Union as a representative of all Israeli workers, even though its very nature is to discriminate against Palestinians and all Arab workers. And so within the Histadrut itself, whenever, and I'll get to this in a minute, whenever the Palestinians or Arab workers would go out on strike, the Histadrut would send in Israeli workers to break those strikes. As you can imagine, the Histadrut never saw itself as representing both the Jewish workers and the Palestinian workers. Pre-1948, Histadrut founded the Haganah, the Zionist terrorist group in the 1920s, and Mapai, which was the precursor to the Israeli Labor Party in the 1930s. Ben-Gurion was Histadrut's first Secretary General, who became, in 1935, chairman of the Jewish Agency, the Zionist government in waiting, and in 1948, the Minister of the State of Israel. Ben-Gurion made it clear that there was no reason to respect Palestinian rights, and that it was also clear that the Palestinians, understandably, would not give up their land without a fight. So Ben-Gurion was absolutely categorically aware and said so, that we are taking somebody else's land, period. And since that's the case, we have every expectation that the Palestinians, the Arabs, would not be happy about this. And therefore, over time, Ben-Gurion started to talk about the transfer of Palestinian workers to other places to eliminate them from the land of Israel. He argued, we do not recognize the right of Palestinian Arabs to rule the country since Palestine is still undeveloped and awaits the builders. So, I mean, there can't be a more profound argument about Ben-Gurion and the Israeli state, which basically argues that the Palestinians are incapable of, of sourcing their own land, of creating industry, and that it took the whites who came from Eastern Europe to build this country. He also said, that the Palestinian workers should not be paid as much as Israeli workers because they're not nearly as intelligent. So the attitude of the Israeli Zionists was basically the attitude of the British, the French, all the people that colonized, you know, other part, Latin America, Asia, Africa, the same mentality. We are superior. We've come here to move those barbarians aside and to build a civilized society. Its enterprises included Truva, I can't pronounce it, which is dairy products, Solel Bonot, with the building and construction, and core manufacturing, Hamsberg Food Cooperative, and the bank Hapollon. It established a holding company, Hevrat Ovdin, to manage these enterprises, which remained 100% in Jewish hands. In the 1920s, as unemployment grew in the Zionist economy in Palestine, Histadrut launched a campaign to promote Jewish labor and Jewish produce, boycotting Arab labor and produce. One of the members of the Histadrut said, "I had to fight my friends on the issue of Jewish socialism to defend the fact that I would not accept Arabs in my trade union. The Histadrut to defend preaching to housewives that they should not buy at Arab stores, to defend the fact that we should guard our orchards to prevent Arab workers from getting jobs there, to put kerosene on Arab tomatoes, to attack Jewish housewives in markets and smash Arab eggs they had bought, to buy dozens of dunams, which is land, from the Arabs is permitted, but to sell, God forbid, one Jewish dunam to an Arab is prohibited. To take Rothschild, the incarnation of capitalism, a socialist, and name him the benefactor." So I just want to go back 1 second, because the philosophy of fascism is one that we're all in this together. We're all Jews, and we have to deny the fact that there is class struggle. So somebody like Rothschild, who is a billionaire many times over and has intervened in many countries to undermine any sort of, even among Jews, is now our benefactor, as opposed to a problem for the Jewish working class. Ultimately, it's not surprising, given the philosophy of Herzl and the philosophy of Zionism, that there would be a fascist mentality, which I think is growing and has been growing in Israel for quite some time. At the mention of Arab workers who were working in the Jewish establishment, the Histadrut used funds to organize pickets against the Arabs. I mean, anything other than class solidarity, because we're building a nation, a capitalist nation of Jews. Racist to the core. Class struggle from the beginning was defined as a struggle against Arab labor, not against the bosses, not against the capitalist companies, but against Arabs. Ben-Gurion argued that the role of the working class was a national one, to construct the Jewish state. Socialism was never an aim in itself, but a tool for the advancement of the national objectives, once again mirroring the language of Mussolini. It was Ben-Gurion who coined the slogan "from class to nation." Both perspectives saw the role of labor as a nationalist role. Many of the prominent Israeli leaders admired Mussolini, and basically they admired the strong-armedness of Mussolini and the fascists, and were pleased the fact, and their argument was that he wasn't racist. You know, unlike Hitler, Mussolini wasn't racist against the Jews. So we should be happy about that. Regarding equality of pay, as I mentioned, the Arabs were not nearly as intelligent as the Jews and therefore did not deserve equal pay. In 1924, although Arab workers joined the Union of Railway, Postal, and Telegraph Workers in an intercommunal trade organization, the Histadrut made an attempt to isolate those Arab workers into separate organizations, very similar to what the AFL did from its very inception. The AFL had Jim Crow unions that put blacks in unions, that put women in other unions, and were not integrated into the unions that the white, I mean, it was set up by white craft unionists, and essentially the blacks and Latins and Mexicans and were denied entry into the AFL, and ultimately there were Jim Crow unions set up, but those blacks were in their own unions. They weren't part of or integrated into the AFL per se. Their membership card, this is the Israeli membership card, said the Federation of Jewish Workers. In the meantime, there were Arabs who were in the union, and it was a complete, disrespect and denial of the fact that the Arabs are paying dues to the Histadrut. In 1936, during a general strike of Arab workers, the Histadrut got to work replacing Arab workers with Jewish workers. With the support of the British authorities, the Jewish Agency and the Histadrut established Tel Aviv as an alternative port to Jaffa. There was a solid general strike in 1936 in opposition to the emigration of so many Jews coming down to Palestine, and from the support of the British in support of the emigration of the Jews. So the Palestinians went out on strike, and the first thing the Histadrut did was attempt to replace, what's with that? The Palestinian workers with Jewish workers. Between 1948 and 46, Palestinians living in Israel were subjected to military rule. And yet the Histadrut had a close affiliation to the military administration of the Mapai government. 1995, the Histadrut changed its name to the General Confederation of Labor in the Land of Israel. Once again, another attempt to claim more land for Israel, for the Israeli concern. It was a way of pushing the Palestinians out of their homeland and creating what was the homeland for the Jews. And the Histadrut was absolutely part and parcel in participating in this removal of Palestinians. Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and Gaza cannot join Histadrut, and neither can the Filipino workers or the African workers that are living in Israel at this point. The Histadrut is open to Israeli Jews, and although the Palestinians must pay dues to the Histadrut anyway, whether they're represented by the Histadrut or not. In 1951, seamen who were striking were drafted into the army by the Israeli government. These are Israeli Jews, and with the support of the Histadrut, the drafting of the striking workers. Not a trade union, a model of a trade union organization, I have to say. And this goes back to the 20s, when there was a group of workers who were called, I can't pronounce it right, Guz Avodah workers, who were starved to death, starved into submission by Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion, who was on the leader, one of the leaders of the Histadrut, and then became prime minister. In 1969, Ashdod port workers strikers, which were mixed, both Palestinian and Jews, were on strike, the Jews were accused of being supporters of Fatah. And therefore, the Histadrut attempted to break that strike. There was I'm not sure if people are aware of Land Day, but on March 30th, in 1976, many Arabs went out on strike to defend their land against any more usurpations by the Israelis, and 6 Palestinians were killed. So now every March is Land Day, which the Histadrut does not support. According to the National Insurance Institute, 52% of Israeli Arab citizens live below the poverty line, as opposed to 16% of Jewish Israelis. Almost half of the Arabs employed persons work in low-wage sectors of manufacturing, construction, and retail. Histadrut has never supported Arab workers' fight against racial discrimination, such as the mass layoffs of Arabs that occurred after the outbreak of the Second Intifada in 2000, or a labor dispute of Arab and Jewish employees with there was a Dead Sea Hotel Nirvana in 2003, where an Arab manager allowed his Arab workers to speak in Arabic, and he was fired. I'm going to just skip a lot. Okay, so ultimately, where are we today? And one last thing about this. So the permits are never given to Palestinians to develop homes or to rebuild their homes, unless, of course, they want the Arabs to collaborate with them. Other than that, they can never get a permit to build their homes or rebuild their homes. So where are we today? There's a manual put out by the Jewish Labor Committee for pro-Israel, which is a pro-Israel lobby, which blatantly says, please do not discuss with union members, representatives of the press, or others guesstimates of the value of State of Israel bonds held by unions. Divest from Israel activists have used such information in their arguments and have quoted figures found in Jewish newspapers and or provided by Jewish communal representatives. Randy Weingarten is a member of this organization. She is the head of the AFT, my union. U.S. labor movement invested and continues to invest in Israel since the 1950s. Unions and their pension funds have been buying up State of Israel bonds. The American labor unions hold billions in Israeli bonds. The AFT alone reported to the Department of Labor that the union has invested $200,000 in state Israeli bonds. Trumka, the former head of the AFL, absolutely opposed support for BDS. More recently, members of the Connecticut AFL-CIO successfully got the State Labor Federation to dump $25,000 in Israel bonds in 2010. 5 years later, the Connecticut Federation passed a resolution calling on the national AFL-CIO to support BDS. This vote was annulled by Trumka. Again, after determining the vote was fair and democratic in late 2015, the UAW's International Executive Board nevertheless nullified Local 2865's BDS measure after being pressured by a corporate law firm representing companies doing business in Israel. So the AFL-CIO that stands firmly behind the State of Israel in both funding and public support for its policies, undermining the democratic rights of Palestinians that were stolen by the Israeli state and the Histadrut at its inception. My final thing is, if the working class does not break from the AFL leadership and form an organization for itself, a working class organization that understands the need for working class solidarity internationally, then ultimately we will see more war, more global warming, more depression, and the American working class will fundamentally not understand that its allegiance needs to be with the Palestinian workers and workers around the world, or we will suffer serious consequences as we've seen in World War I, in World War II, and thereafter.